Hello, good evening, and welcome everyone um, to the second session of geometry revision that we have as part of our ongoing 100 Days to CAD program. So we are going to be looking at geometry once again. And once again, what I'm going to be doing is I'm only going to be discussing basic theory for you to make notes. We are not going to solve any questions. And today's topic, of course, is going to be circles and polygons. Right? So we are going to be looking at circles, polygons, their basic concepts and theorems that we need to know before we get into problem solving as far as geometry is concerned. Okay, so let's start with the topic of circles. So before we get into any concepts, let's first familiarize ourselves with all the terms and terminologies that are associated with circles. Right. Firstly, definition of a circle, of course, is it's the locus of a moving point. Locus means path traced by. So path traced by a moving point when it moves in such a way that it maintains a fixed distance from a fixed point. Right? So the fixed point, as we all know, is the center of the circle. Okay. So fixed point is called center. The fixed distance that the moving point maintains from the center is called radius. And the total displacement of the moving point, the total distance that the moving point covers throughout, is called the circumference of the circle. Right? So the definition of these three we get from the basic definition of circle itself. And if we know what these three are, then these three are related to each other by a very simple formula that we can say is that circumference is proportional to twice the radius, right? And of course, if you want to make this into an equation, then the constant, the proportionality constant of this equation is pi. So pi is basically defined as a constant which represents ratio of circumference to twice the radius of any circle in this entire universe, right? So that is what is circumference, radius, and circle. Apart from these, there are several other constructions of significance and several other terms that are associated with circles. So let's go through each one of them and understand what each one of them are. So next, let's understand what is chord of a circle. Chord is basically a line segment. Okay, it's not a straight line. Chord is a line segment, which is section of a straight line, which is formed by joining any 2 points on the circumference of a circle. So in this figure, AB is a chord. Right. Next, what is arc of a circle? So basically, arc is section of a circle circumference. So what I can say is that a chord of a circle divides the entire circumference of the circle into 2 arcs. This is an arc and this is an arc. The smaller arc is called the minor arc and the bigger arc is called the major arc. So if a question says that this is a figure that's given to you and we are going to look at the minor arc AB, basically we have to look at this arc, the smaller arc that the points A and B are dividing the circumference into, right? So that is arc of a circle. Next, we have segment of a circle. So segment is very similar to the arc of a circle concept because basically what we saw is that a chord divides a circle circumference into 2 arcs. Similarly, a chord divides a circle's area into 2 segments. Okay, so this is a segment, and of course this is also a segment, right? So a chord divides a circle's area into 2 segments. Once again, the smaller segment is called the minor segment and the bigger segment is called the major segment. Okay. Next, we have something called sector of a circle. Sector is also a circle's section of a circle's area, but it's the area of the circle which is bound by 2 radii and 1 arc. Right? So if I have, say, 2 points P and Q here, then the area that P and Q subtend at the center of the circle is what is called sector of a circle. And sector is always defined by the angle that gets subtended at the center of the circle. Right? So if the question says that there's a sector of 15 degrees, that means that the angle subtended at the center of the sector is 15 degrees. Okay. Next, we all know what a tangent is. Tangent basically is a straight line which is drawn in such a way that it touches the circumference of the circle at exactly 1 point. Right? So if I have a straight line xy, and such that it is touching the circle at the point z, then this straight line is called the tangent of a circle. And this point z is referred to as the point of contact of the tangent. Okay. Next, of course, there is a normal of a circle. By definition, normal is a line segment which is formed by joining the center of a circle to the point of contact of a tangent. So the thing to note here is that if there is no tangent, then there cannot be any normal. So tangent and normal always go hand in hand. Whenever there is a tangent, there is going to be a normal, and to all tangents, there is of course going to be only one normal. Normal is a line segment formed by joining center of a circle to the point of contact of the tangent, and the property of the normal is that it will always be perpendicular to the tangent at the point of contact. Okay. And finally, after tangent and normal, we have got secant of a circle. So what is secant? Secant is basically a straight line which passes through the circle and cuts it at 2 points. So if I have a straight line L, let me call it L1. Okay. L1 is passing through the circle and cutting the circumference at 2 points, and L1 is the secant of the circle. Right? Now, the question is, then how is it different from a chord of a circle? So remember, as I said, chord is a line segment, whereas secant is a straight line. So what I can say is that the relation between chord and secant is that the section of a secant which is present inside the circle is what is called a chord. Right? And the straight line that a chord is a part of is called the secant of a circle. Right? So these are the basic terms and terminologies associated with circles. Moving forward, let's look at different ways in which two circles on a plane can interact with each other. So broadly speaking, two circles on a plane can interact with each other in 3 ways. Okay, so let's go through those ways one by one. First way is I can have two circles on a plane which are not touching each other at all. Now, when two circles are not touching each other at all, this can happen in 2 ways. Right? The first way is when one circle is present within the other. Second is when both the circles are present external to each other. Now, when one circle is present within the other, then even that case has got 2 different possibilities, because I can have the 2 circles with one present within the other and both of them sharing the same center. And when this happens, then these 2 circles are called concentric circles. Or I can have 2 circles, one present within the other, not touching each other, but they do not share the same center. And in this case, the 2 circles are called eccentric circles. Now, whenever there's a case of a pair of eccentric circles in a question, there might be one term which is often used, which is called offset. So if a question tells you that 2 eccentric circles are offset by 2 centimeters, then basically that 2 centimeters is referring to the distance between the centers of the 2 circles. Right? So distance between the centers of 2 eccentric circles is what is called the offset distance. Right? So this is the case of 2 circles not touching each other and one present within the other. We can also have 2 circles not touching each other and both present external to each other, right? Looking like this. Now, in this case, it might seem as if the 2 circles have got nothing in common, but the fact is that we can make certain common constructions between these 2 circles. And of course, the common constructions that I'm talking about is that I can draw a set of common tangents between the 2 circles. So if I look at these 2 circles, then the total number of common tangents that I can draw between these 2 circles is 4. I can draw 4 common tangents between these 2 circles. I can draw 2 like this, and I can draw 2 more like this. Now this tangent here and this tangent here, which are present on the same side of the center of both the circles. So what do I mean by same side of the center is, if I take the circle center here, the circle center here, then this tangent is present above both the centers. This tangent here is present below both the centers. So these 2 tangents which are present on the same side of the center of both the circles are referred to as DCTs, or direct common tangents. And these 2 tangents which are crossing over and cutting each other, these 2 tangents are called TCTs, or transverse common tangents. So whenever 2 circles on a plane are not touching each other externally, you can draw a pair of DCTs and a pair of TCTs to these 2 circles. Okay. So this is the first case of 2 circles interacting with each other on a plane, which is that they don't touch each other at all. Second way in which 2 circles on a plane can interact with each other is when they are touching each other at exactly 1 point. Now, even this can happen in 2 ways. Why? Because either the circle can touch each other internally like this, or they can touch each other externally like this. Now, in the first case, of course, I can draw 1 common tangent. And in the second case, I can draw 3 common tangents. So of these 3 common tangents between these 2 circles which are touching each other externally on a plane, these 2 tangents, of course, are DCTs. This is a DCT, This is a DCT. But this third one is not called a TCT. It's called a tangent through the point of contact. Pardon my handwriting. Through the point of contact. Okay, it's not called a transverse common tangent. Transverse common tangents only exist in the case of when two circles are not touching each other externally. Okay. All right. And in this case, of course, this tangent is called the tangent through the point of contact. Now, in both these cases, there is one single speciality, which is that if I take the centers of these two circles like this, then the speciality of both these cases is that the straight line which joins the centers of these two circles which are touching each other at a point will always pass through the point of contact of the two circles. So if I draw a straight line touching these two centers, it will pass through the point of contact. Touching these two centers, this will also pass through the point of contact. Now, if I take this case of the two circles touching each other at a point externally, and if I consider the circle on the left's radius as R1, circle on the right's radius as R2, then distance between the centers of these two circles is simply R1 plus R2. Similarly, in this case, if I take the radius of the bigger circle as R1, smaller circle as R2, then distance between the centers of these two circles is R1 minus R2. So this is one thing to remember, is that whenever two circles are touching each other at a point on a plane, then the distance between the centers will either be equal to sum of the radii or be equal to difference between the radii, depending upon whether they are touching each other externally or they are touching each other internally. So this is the second case or second way in which two circles on a plane can interact with each other. Third way, of course, is going to be when two circles on a plane are cutting each other at 2 points. And in this case, of course, I can draw two direct common tangents between the two circles. But apart from common tangents, in this particular case, I can also draw a common chord. This is another construction in common to the two circles that we can make whenever they are cutting each other at 2 points on a plane. And this construction is going to be very important and significant in certain mensuration questions, especially when you have to find out the area which is common to two circles which are cutting each other at 2 points. Invariably, you would have to draw the common chord. Okay. So this is the number of ways in which two circles on a plane can interact with each other. Okay. Now, moving forward, of course, if we want to solve questions based on circles in geometry, we need to have the knowledge of certain theorems. Now, if I look at theorems in geometry based on circles, there are actually easily, I would say, 100 different theorems. And it's impossible for us to remember all 100 theorems and what they are actually trying to convey to us. But what I have seen and gotten a sense of understanding is that if we have the knowledge of 6 basic circle-based theorems, then those are sufficient for us to solve most of the questions. And when I say most, I mean 95, 96, 97% of the questions of circles are based on these 6 theorems. Right? So if you know these 6 theorems, you can take a fair shot at CAT questions very, very easily. Not just CAT, any B-School entrance examination for that matter, any aptitude-based examination which has a geometry component to it, these 6 theorems are the basic that we need to know and remember. Right? So let's go through them one by one. So for theorem number 1, say let me take a circle, and within the circle, say suppose I draw a chord, and let me call this chord, say AB. Now this chord AB is dividing the circle's area into 2 segments, right? The major segment and the minor segment. Now let me draw a few straight lines like this. Okay. And 2 more straight lines like this, suppose I draw. Okay. And if I call this point C and if I call this point D, I can say angle ACB is an angle being subtended by the chord AB at the circumference of the major segment. Similarly, angle ADB, this is also an angle being subtended by the chord AB at the circumference of the major segment. So theorem number 1 says these 2 angles will be equal. So all angles which are subtended by a chord at the circumference of the same segment will be equal to each other. So any angle that I draw subtended at the circumference of the major segment by the same chord AB, all these angles will be equal to each other. So angle ACB will be equal to angle ADB, will be equal to angle AB, will be equal to angle AFB, and so on and so forth. Similarly, if we say subtend an angle, say APB, at the circumference of the minor segment, then of course angle APB and angle ACB or ADB or AFB will not be equal to angle APB. Why? Because they are present in two different segments of the circle. But if I draw, say, a second angle which is being subtended by the chord AB in the minor segment AQB, then angle APB and angle AQB will definitely be equal to each other. So angles subtended by a chord in the same segment will be equal. In the same segment of the circle will be equal to each other. That's the first theorem, theorem number 1. Moving on, second theorem, theorem number 2. Theorem number 2 is called the chord section theorem. So for the chord section theorem, let's do one thing. Let's presume that I have a circle, and within the circle, I have two random chords which are cutting each other. Okay. So these are just any two random chords which are intersecting each other at some random point within the circle. And let me call the two chords, say AB and CD, and suppose they are cutting each other at the point P. Then the chord section theorem states that PA into PB will be equal to PC into PD. Okay. So product of the sections of two intersecting chords will be equal to each other. That's the second theorem in circles. Third theorem in circles is a very famous theorem. We have all studied this theorem in school. So for this, say, suppose I have a circle, let me take a chord inside the circle. And suppose the center of the circle is, say, O. Okay. And suppose this chord is AB. Now from the center of the circle, if I drop a perpendicular onto this chord AB, such that the foot of this perpendicular on AB is C, then theorem number 3 states that C will be the midpoint of AB. So perpendicular drawn from center of a circle onto a chord will bisect the chord. Okay, perpendicular drawn from center of a circle onto a chord will always bisect the chord. So these are the first 3 basic theorems. Right? Fourth theorem in circle. Fourth theorem is again a very famous theorem. Again, this is something that we have all studied in school. So let me take a circle once again with, say, center O. And suppose there are 2 points in the circumference. Let me call those 2 points A and B. Now, if I join the center of the circle to these 2 points A and B, then I can say that these 2 points A and B subtend an angle AOB at the center of the circle. Okay. Now, suppose as a third point on the circumference, let me call that third point C. And I'm once again going to join C with these 2 initial points A and B. So now in this figure, I can say angle ACB is an angle which is being subtended by the 2 points AB at the circumference. So angle ACB is an angle at the circumference, angle AOB is the angle at the center. So the fourth theorem in circle states that angle at the center will be twice the angle at the circumference. Okay. So this is a very, very famous theorem in circle. And I know that most of us are actually very, very familiar with this theorem, but there's one very common mistake that we make when we're applying this theorem and which we do not understand properly. So let's understand a few things about this theorem. That the primary thing that we have to be very careful about while we are applying this theorem number 4 is that we have to make sure the angle at the center and angle at the circumference need to be present in different sectors of the circle. So what I mean is, if I look at the circle now, there is one sector here which is this sector, right? This sector. And there's a second sector which is this sector. Okay. So it's a red sector and there's a blue sector. The angle at the center is present in the red sector. The angle at the circumference is present in the blue sector. So only when the angle at the center and circumference are present in different sectors of the circle can we apply this theorem that angle at the center is twice the angle at the circumference. Let me make this slightly clearer by drawing a different image. So once again, let me take this circle with center O, but this time say points A and B are here and C is at the same place. And once again, let me join A and B with the center of the circle. Let me join A and B with C as well. So when I look at this figure, now once again, I can say that angle ACB, this angle is the angle at the circumference of the circle. A and B are subtending angle ACB at the circumference of the circle. Now this angle is present in this sector of the circle. So the angle at the center needs to be measured in the opposite sector. And that opposite sector is this sector. So this angle ACB will be half of this angle at the center. So the reflex of angle AOB is the one which will be twice of angle ACB in this figure. Always remember, angle at the center and circumference need to be measured on the opposite sectors or in different sectors of the circle. Now, if this is clear, this theorem has got a very famous corollary, and I'm sure that all of us are famous or definitely familiar with that corollary. So for that corollary, let me once again take a circle and with center O. But this time, suppose I tell you that the points A and B are two diametrically opposite points. Right? Diametrically opposite points means when I join AO and BO, they form a straight line. They form the diameter of the circle. Now, if I take a point of the circumference C and I join AC and BC, then the value of angle ACB will of course be equal to 90 degree. Why? Because the angle at the center is 180 degrees. And angle at the circumference needs to be half of that angle. So angle ACB will be equal to 180 by 2, which is 90 degrees. So this is a very famous corollary and very important, significant corollary as far as our questions in CAT are concerned. Why? Because we have to understand that whenever there's a diameter divides a circle's area into two halves. And each of these halves is what we call a semicircle. So this corollary is also referred to as angle in a semicircle will always be equal to 90 degree. Right? Angle ACB is an angle being subtended at the semicircle by the 2 points A and B. So all angles of the semicircle will be equal to 90 degree. So if you see a semicircle inside a question, or if you see a diameter inside a circle in a question, and doesn't matter whether you want to find out side lengths or angles, you have to turn to this particular theorem. Because why? Because whenever we have a right angle inside a question, we can not only get the value of certain angles, we can also use that to apply the Pythagoras theorem to find out side lengths. So 90 degree angles are very, very important and very valuable inside geometry questions. Right? So this is theorem number 4. Moving on, theorem number 5. Theorem number 5 is called the alternate segment theorem. Now this theorem is the one which most students have a lot of confusion with. So I'll quickly explain this as well. So for this, say suppose I take a circle and suppose to this circle there's a tangent. Let me call the tangent say XY. Point of contact of the tangent is say P. And suppose in this figure I also have a chord passing through the point of contact P, and let me call this chord PQ. Okay. So now if I look at this figure, the tangent XY and the chord PQ are forming two angles. Right? One angle is angle QPY, and one angle is angle QPX. Okay. So let us do one thing for the sake of convenience. Let's first focus on one of these angles. Let us focus on angle QPY. So QPY is an angle formed by a tangent and a chord at the point of contact. And this angle is present in the direction of this segment, right? Is present in the direction of the minor segment PQ. So alternate segment theorem states that any angle which the chord PQ subtends at the alternate segment or the opposite segment will be equal to angle QPY. So angle QPY will be equal to angle QRP. So angle formed by a chord and a tangent at the point of contact will be equal to any angle subtended by the chord at the circumference of the alternate segment. So that's why angle QRP will be equal to angle QPY. Similarly, now if I take the case of angle QPX, QPX is also an angle formed by the chord and the tangent at the point of contact, and this angle is present in the direction of the major segment of the circle. So any angle that the chord PQ subtends in the opposite segment or the minor segment, like this angle QSP will be equal to angle QPX. This is the alternate segment theorem for circles. Okay. All right. And the last theorem is called the secant section theorem. So secant section theorem, that theorem sounds very similar to the chord section theorem because they are very similar. Because in a chord section theorem, we need a pair of intersecting chords. In secant section theorem, I need a pair of intersecting secants. Right? So two secants which are cutting each other, and of course, if they cut each other inside the circle, then it becomes a chord section theorem. So let me assume that they're cutting each other somewhere external to the circle, and let me call this external point P. And let me call the first secant say PAB, second secant PCD. Then the secant section theorem states that PA into PB is equal to PC into PD. It states the same thing as the chord section theorem. The product of the sections of two intersecting secants will be equal. Okay. Now there's one mistake which I've seen several students and even several textbooks make, is that they misquote this formula as PA into AB is equal to PC into CD. This is absolutely incorrect. This is not the secant section theorem. Why? Because let us understand one thing, both with respect to geometry as well as with respect to coordinate geometry, that sections of straight lines are always calculated from the point of intersection. So always remember, when you're taking sections of secants, calculate the sections from the point of intersection. It's PA into PB is equal to PC into PD. This is the secant section theorem. And there is, of course, one corollary to this theorem. For that, say suppose from this point P, if I draw a tangent to the circle, let me call the point of contact of this tangent as say Q. Then the corollary states that P into PB is equal to PC into PD will be equal to PQ square. Right? So this is the sixth theorem in circles. Okay. All right. Apart from this, these are the six major theorems. Apart from this, there's a seventh property when it comes to two circles, which I point out in the class as very, very important concept that we all have to understand. And that concept is that if say I have two circles and I have a direct common tangent to the two circles, okay, doesn't matter whether the two circles are separated by a distance or whether they are touching each other or whether they're cutting each other. For any one of these three cases, say suppose I have two circles and I have a DCT to them, then always remember length of the direct common tangent will be less than the distance between the centers of the two circles. Length of direct common tangent between two circles, any two circles, be it not touching each other at a point or cutting each other at 2 points, length of DCT will always be less than distance between the centers of the two circles. In one special case though, the length of DCT can be equal to the distance between the centers of the two circles. And this can only happen when radius of the two circles are equal to each other. So only when the radius of the two circles are equal, then direct common tangent's length will be equal to the distance between the centers of the two circles. In every other case, length of the DCT will always be less than the length or less than the distance between the centers of the two circles. And doesn't matter what of what nature those two circles are, whether they are touching each other, not touching each other, cutting each other at 2 points, it doesn't matter. These will always hold true. Okay, so that is the basics of circles. Right? Now let's move on to polygons as well, and let's get a sense of understanding of the basic concepts of polygons that we need to have an understanding of when we are solving questions. Okay. Firstly, based on the shape of polygons, they can be broadly classified into concave and convex. Okay. Now we know what concave and convex shapes are. Concave shapes, concave has the word cave in it. Right, so a shape which caves inward towards its center, it's called a concave shape. And convex is a shape which bulges outward from its center. It's called a convex shape. A circle is a convex shape, right? Polygons though can be concave or convex. And the first question that I generally ask in my class to my students when it comes to polygons is that if I have this polygon, if I have a polygon like this, is this a concave polygon or a convex polygon? And there is going to be a lot of confusion because this vertex is pointing outward, or this vertex is bulging outward, this vertex is caving inward. So is this concave or convex? Or sometimes students say, sir, it's both. Well, of course, it cannot be both, but it is one of these two. So this kind of a polygon is a concave polygon. Why? Because there is one vertex which is caving inward. And that is sufficient for us to say that the polygon is a concave polygon. Why? Because imagine Can you ever draw a polygon in which all vertices are caving inward? It is impossible to draw such a figure, right? If one vertex is caving inward, the other vertices have to bulge outward. So even if a single vertex of a polygon caves inward towards its center, it's called a concave polygon. Only when all the vertices are bulging outward will it be called a convex polygon. And the mathematical quantification of the concaveness of a polygon is determined by the interior angle. So how do I quantify whether a vertex is caving inward or not? Very, very simple, because if I look at this particular interior angle of the polygon, then this interior angle is of course going to be greater than 180 degrees, right? So only when an interior angle of a polygon is greater than 180, only then can you have a vertex which is caving inward. So concave polygon is a polygon in which even one single angle is greater than 180 degree. A convex polygon is a polygon in which all interior angles are less than 180 degrees. That is the basic distinction between concave and convex polygons, right? Okay, moving on. If you look at polygons, it's one of the simplest parts of a syllabus. So I'd say that there are only two fundamental properties of polygons that we all have to remember. First property is, of course, sum of exterior angles. Sum of exterior angles of a polygon is equal to 360 degrees. Right. Now the question is, what do I mean by sum of exterior angles? So if you remember the last, say, triangles properties class, I had asked you how many exterior angles does a triangle have, and the answer is it has 6 exterior angles. Similarly, if I look at, say, this pentagon will have 5 exterior angles that can be formed by producing the sides in the clockwise direction like this, and I can have 5 more by producing the sides in the counterclockwise direction like this. Okay. So total I will have 10 exterior angles in this pentagon. But now the question is, when I'm saying that sum of exterior angles of a polygon is 360 degrees, do I mean that sum of all 10 of these is 360? I absolutely do not. Okay. So when this property says sum of exterior angles of a polygon is 360 degrees, it means sum of these 5 exterior angles is 360 and sum of these 5 exterior angles is 360. Okay. All right. So this is the first fundamental property for all polygons. Sum of exterior angles is 360 and sum of exterior angles formed by producing the sides in one particular direction is 360 degrees. So when I produce the sides in the clockwise direction, their sum is equal to 360. And when I produce the sides in the counterclockwise direction, then their sum is 360 degrees. Okay. All right. That's the first fundamental property in polygons. Second fundamental property in polygons is, of course, we have sum of exterior angles. So we'll also have sum of interior angles. Sum of interior angles is equal to n minus 2 into 180 degrees, where n is the number of sides of the polygon. Okay, so these are the basic two properties that we have to remember as far as polygons is concerned. Now, based on lengths of sides, polygons can be classified into broadly two types. You can either have regular polygons or you can have irregular polygons. So regular polygons are what? So regular polygons are those polygons in which all sides are equal. All angles, or let me call this, all interior angles are equal. All exterior angles are equal. So when these three are satisfied, then the polygon becomes a regular polygon. Even when a single one of these is not satisfied, then it becomes an irregular polygon. So now the question that is asked in several times that confuses students is rhombus a regular polygon? Now, if I look at most textbooks, they say that when all sides become equal, then the polygon is going to be a regular polygon. But then rhombus becomes a regular polygon, but it does not satisfy the remaining two conditions. So actually speaking, rhombus is not a regular polygon. Okay. So this is one single exception where all sides are equal, but the remaining two conditions don't get satisfied, and rhombus becomes an irregular polygon. In the case of any other polygon, okay, whenever you have got, say, a pentagon in which all, say, five sides are equal, the remaining two conditions will get satisfied. In case of a hexagon, if all sides are equal, the remaining two conditions will get satisfied. In case of triangles also, if all sides are equal, the remaining two conditions will get satisfied. Rhombus is a curious case of a polygon which has all sides equal, but it is still not a regular polygon because all its interior angles are not equal. Okay. So the quadrilateral, which is a regular polygon, is a square. Okay, so rhombus is an irregular polygon. This is something that is a curious case, so I thought you should know it. All right, now let's look at the regular polygon and let's understand a few say properties of diagonals of regular polygons. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, for my own convenience, say consider a regular octagon to explain the properties of diagonals, a few properties of diagonals of a regular polygon. So say suppose I have, just a second. Yeah, say suppose I have a regular octagon like this. Okay. Let me call this regular octagon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. So there are several diagonals that I can draw in this regular octagon, right? So diagonals are drawn by joining any two vertices which are not adjacent to each other. Okay. So 1, 3 is also a diagonal. 2, 5 is also a diagonal. 4, 7 is also a diagonal, right? All these are diagonals because I'm joining any two vertices which are not adjacent to each other, right? Now, in regular polygons, some diagonals will be of the same length, some will not be of the same length. And generally speaking, it's very, very simple to figure out which two diagonals are equal in length and which two are not. So if I look at these three diagonals that I've drawn here, 2, 5, 4, 7, and 3, 1. Of these, just by looking at the figure, most of us can infer and conclude that the diagonal 2, 5 and the diagonal 4, 7 have the same length, whereas 1, 3 is definitely shorter than 2, 5 and 4, 7, right? So this most of us can instinctively point out which diagonals are equal in the case of regular polygons. But if you are ever having a sense of a confusion, you're not being able to figure out whether two diagonals of a polygon are equal or not, then what you can do is you can apply a very simple trick to figure out whether the two diagonals are equal or not. So that trick is, say, suppose, let me take the case of diagonal 1, 3 first. Now the diagonal 1, 3 is formed by joining the vertices 1 and 3. So I'm starting from 1, I'm leaving 2, then I'm joining 3. So between the two joined vertices, there is exactly one unjoined vertex. Similarly, if I take the diagonal 2, 5, then I'm starting from 2, I'm leaving 3, I'm leaving 4, I'm joining 5. So between the two joined vertices, I have got two unjoined vertices. So because the number of unjoined vertices for diagonal 1, 3 and diagonal 2, 5 are different, so that is sufficient for me to say that these two diagonals will have different lengths. Now the same thing I do for, say, the diagonal 4, 7. I'm starting from 4, I'm leaving 5, I'm leaving 6, I'm joining 7. So in this case, once again, between the two joined vertices, I have got two unjoined vertices. Now the number of unjoined vertices for the diagonal 2, 5 and the diagonal 4, 7 are equal. That is sufficient for me to say that 2, 5 and 4, 7 will be of the same length. Right? So this is a basic trick that you can apply in the case of regular polygons to figure out whether two diagonals are equal in length or not. This does not work in the case of irregular polygons. So don't try to do this in the case of irregular polygons. It is not going to work out. Okay. All right. Now for the second property, let me consider once again the same regular octagon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now say in this diagonal or in this regular octagon, let me consider two diagonals, say 6, 2 and 6, 3. Now 6, 2 and 6, 3 are referred to as two consecutive diagonals drawn from the same vertex, right? And it makes sense. Both of these are drawn from the same vertex 6 and they are formed by joining two vertices which are consecutive to each other. 2 and 3 are consecutive vertices. So from 6, I'm joining 2 and from 6, I'm joining 3. So 6, 2 and 6, 3 are two consecutive diagonals from the same vertex. Now there's a formula for finding out the value of the angle formed by two consecutive diagonals from the same vertex. And this angle, let's call it theta. The formula for finding out the value of theta is 180 by n in the case of regular polygons. In the case of regular polygons, angle between two consecutive diagonals drawn from the same vertex is always 180 by n. Okay. What this means is that I can use this formula to find out the angle between any two diagonals drawn from the same vertex. Why? Because let me draw all diagonals, suppose from say this vertex 6. So let me join 6, 1, let me join 6, 8 and 6, 4. So then this angle is theta, this angle is theta, this is theta, this is theta, and surprisingly even this is theta and this is theta. So any angle between two diagonals drawn from the same vertex, or even one side and one diagonal, you can find out by knowing the basic formula for theta, which is equal to 180 degrees by n, where n is of course the number of sides of the regular polygon. Once again, remember that we are only talking about regular polygons in this case. We are not talking about irregular polygons. So suppose say there's a question which says that there's a diagonal 6, 2, and I have to find out the angle between this side 6, 2, sorry, the side 6, 7 and the diagonal 2, 6. Then the value of this angle is 3 theta. So it's 180 degree by n into 3. That's it. Straight formula and you'll get the answer. Okay. So this is the second thing that I wanted to discuss with respect to diagonals of a regular polygon. And third and final thing that I want to discuss with respect to diagonals of a regular polygon is the concept of principal diagonals. So when I ask students what is a principal diagonal, several times I get the answer as, sir, it's the longest diagonal. So longest diagonal is the property of a principal diagonal. Of course, principal diagonals are the longest diagonals of a polygon, right? But the definition of a principal diagonal is that the diagonal formed by joining two vertices which are exact opposite of each other, which are exactly opposite to each other. When you join those two vertices, then you get a principal diagonal. So then if I take the case of a pentagon, say suppose let me call this pentagon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Which is the principal diagonal in this figure? Is 1, 3 a principal diagonal? Sorry. Is 1, 3 a principal diagonal? I'd say no. Why? Because 1 and 3 are not exact opposite of each other. Because if I look to the right of the diagonal 1, 3, I've got only one vertex. If I look to the left of 1, 3, I've got two vertices. So then the question is 2, 5 a principal diagonal? Once again, no, because on top of 2, 5, there is only one vertex. Below 2, 5, there are two vertices. So what we are actually learning here right now is that the concept of principal diagonals cannot exist in the case of polygons with an odd number of sides. Why? Because in the case of polygons which have an odd number of sides, no two diagonals are exact opposite of each other. So concept of principal diagonals can exist only in the case of regular polygons with an even number of sides. Okay. So let me do one thing. Let me once again take the case of the same regular octagon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now in this polygon, it's very simple to figure out that the principal diagonals are formed by joining 1 and 5, and by joining 2 and 6, and by joining 3, 7, and 4, 8. So all these are principal diagonals of the regular octagon. 1, 5, 2, 6, 3, 7, 4, 8. These are formed by joining vertices which are exact opposite to each other. Right? And if we look at this figure now, it becomes very clear that all the principal diagonals are concurrent. Concurrent means they cut each other at the same point. And this point of concurrency of the principal diagonals of a regular polygon is called the center of the polygon. And center of a polygon only exists in the case of regular polygons with an even number of sides. And what does the center do? The center first, it divides all the principal diagonal into two equal halves. Right? It is a midpoint of all the principal diagonals. Also, because it's a midpoint of all principal diagonals, I can say that from this center, when I join all the vertices of this regular polygon, then the regular polygon gets divided into n isosceles triangles. Each of these triangles are going to be isosceles triangles. So from the center of a regular polygon with an even number of sides, when we join the n vertices, then it divides the regular polygon into n isosceles triangles. This is going to be true for the center of all regular polygons with an even number of sides, apart from one single special case. And that special case happens to be in the case of that polygon, which is most prevalent in our, say, geometry questions, also most prevalent in nature, which is a regular hexagon. So why is the regular hexagon so special? Because I don't know whether you have heard of this term or not. There are only 3 regular polygons which can tessellate. Tessellate means which can cover an entire plane using regular polygons. So if I say take the same regular polygon and I say replicate it, and I want to cover an entire plane without any gaps between them, only 3 regular polygons can do this. One is, of course, a square, right? A square is a regular polygon and it can completely cover a plane by just repeating itself without any gaps between them. The second one is an equilateral triangle. Equilateral triangles can also completely cover a plane without any gaps between them if I just keep on replicating them. And the third one is a regular hexagon. Regular hexagon is an extremely symmetrical shape. Why? Because in a regular hexagon, if I draw the principal diagonals, then of course there is going to be a center of this regular hexagon. The center is going to bisect each of the principal diagonals. But this center is going to divide the regular hexagons into 6 not isosceles but equilateral triangles. That's the speciality of a regular hexagon, that from the center of the regular hexagon, when we join the 6 vertices, then it gets divided into 6 equilateral triangles. So the sides are going to be equal to half of the principal diagonals, which means that I can say for a regular hexagon, length of the principal diagonal will always be equal to twice the length of the side. And I can say area of the regular hexagon will be 6 times the area of each of these equilateral triangles. And each of these equilateral triangles, of course, have the same side length as the side length of the regular hexagon. So 6 into root 3 by 4 into a square can be taken as a formula for area of a regular hexagon. Also, property of diagonals or property of principal diagonals of a regular hexagon is also that each of these diagonals will be parallel to 2 of the sides of the hexagon. So this diagonal here will be parallel to this side and this side of the hexagon. This diagonal will be parallel to this side and this side. And finally, this diagonal will be parallel to these 2 sides. So hexagon has got so many degrees of symmetry, and that is why it is the most frequently occurring polygon, not just in our questions in our syllabus, but also the most frequently occurring polygon in nature. And a fun bit of fact, we are actually talking about tessellation here. So if you know who actually won the Nobel Prize for Physics this year, then you will know that tessellation is a very closely related term with what his works have dealt with. That person is Penrose. Okay, Dr. Penrose. Go and do some research on him. There are some beautiful videos on geometric patterns which Dr. Roger Penrose has found out, and he's the Nobel laureate of physics this year. Right. Okay, so with that, I'm going to conclude the session. So these 2 sessions and these 2 videos are basically to familiarize you with basic concepts, properties, theorems, whatever you want to call it, to make notes for geometry. And anything more than this is just going to be surplus information as far as CAT as a paper is concerned. If any other concept beyond this is actually being required to solve a CAT-based question, then that means that CAT question is an extremely difficult question and you need not solve that during the paper. But these are the basics of the 4 shapes that we have as part of our syllabus that we have to remember if we want to give a fair shot at solving geometry-based questions. Right, so thank you so much for watching the video and have a good day. Take care.